Penny. I'm going to start the live session when I go order, so just making sure all your papers, everyone's phones are off. Thank you. Order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. In today's evidence session, we'll be looking at the issue of rough sleeping and temporary accommodation. Really good to have the Minister before us and the Director from MCHLG. I'll ask committee members to introduce themselves, please. I'll start with Joe and any declarable interest.
Joe Powell, Kensington and Bayswater.
Chris Curtis, Milton Keynes North.
Mayor Ellis, Ribble Valley. Nashaba Khan, Gillingham and Rainham.
Florence Eshalomi, Vauxhall and Campbell Green.
Sarah Smith, Hyndburn.
Will Forster, Woking. Lewis Scocking, Broxbourne, and I am a local councillor as well.
Can I get our two witnesses to introduce themselves, please?
Rushanara Ali, Minister for Homelessness and Democracy.
Penny Hobman, Director for Homelessness and Rough Sleeping at MHCLG.
Thank you for coming this morning. Obviously, this is a key issue that continues to be in the media, continues to be something that we as MPs receive in our inbox. And it is good to see that we've got the Minister in front of us this morning just looking at this. Now, we know that earlier last year, Minister, you, Deputy Prime Minister, outlined the first government interdepartment task force on homelessness and rough sleeping. We understand that this group have met once. It would be great to know what was the outcome of that first meeting, who attended, and anything else you're willing to share with us about that first interministerial group.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. And to the committee, I just want to start with saying how delighted I am to be here in front of this committee, and at the fact that this committee is looking at homelessness and rough sleeping, which I know is a subject close to all our hearts, given the challenges we face. And for me, since I joined the team with the Deputy Prime Minister, what I've seen is an absolute commitment to get us back on track to ending homelessness, a manifesto commitment in the government, in the Labour Party's election manifesto. We have already held the first meeting in November last year. The next one is in February, next week. And as part of the interministerial group, we have an expert group of mayors and council leaders and other key stakeholders, and alongside that, we are working to ensure that the voices of those who are affected directly through forums are included. And of course, that is then underpinned by the experience of many of the ministers, and both cabinet ministers as well as other ministers who are in the members of the interministerial task force across government, who bring a great deal of experience and expertise, as you do, on this really important agenda.
So just on that, Minister, the government haven't published any terms of reference for the task force. There are no minutes for that first meeting. We're not even sure which ministers sit on that task force. Are you able to share any of that information with us?
Our aim is to work across government, make sure that those underlying issues that are driving homelessness and rough sleeping are owned by the relevant departments. That's the feature of a number of cross-governmental groups, for instance, the Violence Against Women Interministerial Group, the Child Poverty Interministerial Group, and others. And of course, we will be aiming to publish a strategy in due course, and the departments that are, just to give you an idea of the departments involved, the ministers involved from Department for Education, given of course they have a very strong interest in the number of children. I mean, it's scandalous that we've got over 159,000 children who are in temporary accommodation, and that is driving, of course, child poverty, which is a very important part of that agenda, their agenda. The Homelessness, Department for Social Health and Social Care, Ministry of Justice, MOD, given the veterans' homelessness issues, and Treasury and others. So, we are making sure that happens. And this is an internal government department interministerial group, but we look forward to publishing a report. And also another thing I'm keen to do, and I have already done that with colleagues across Parliament, is to engage directly with colleagues along with this committee, and we look forward to looking at the recommendations that this committee makes, because it's really important that we make that collective effort across the different sectors, both across government, national government, regional government, and local government and organisations, to integrate the thinking and expertise that is there, that's needed to tackle this really challenging agenda.
You want us to come in on this one, Lewis?
No, just follow up, thank you. I mean, your response just sounds like it's a talking shop. So what were the outcomes from the meeting, and what was agreed to be delivered by the next meeting in February?
Each department has lead responsibility, and just to give you an example, this is not a talking shop. We have been taking action in terms of my department. So the first thing we did, the Chancellor, as you know, increased the funding for homelessness by 233 million, bringing the total to £1 billion, which we announced the allocation end of last year. In terms of the work the Department for Education is doing, we've been working closely to get an amendment in the Children and Wellbeing Schools Bill to disapply the intentional homelessness test for young care leavers. That's really important because they're vulnerable, but if you're between 18 and 25, you could find yourself being deemed intentionally homeless. The Home Office has extended, we've worked closely with the Minister Angela Eagle, to extend the move-on period for asylum accommodation to 56 days. That gives local authorities and refugees more time to secure accommodation, enabling them to be able to find their own way when they get refugee status, and we hope that will reduce the pressure on the number of those who end up homeless, and we will see in the coming months how that progresses. DWP obviously is investing £1 billion in extending the Housing Support Fund. The Department for Education has announced, Health and Social Care with my department has announced £58.7 million on the rough sleeping and drug alcohol treatment grant for 25-26. And the MOJ has got work underway on extending the community accommodation service. I could go on. I mean, MOD has also made announcements in terms of 3.5 million funding to extend the reducing veterans homelessness programme until March 2026.
Just in response to Lewis's question, Minister, then, is there any way that you're able to follow up to the committee then what was discussed at the first meeting in terms of maybe writing to us?
We can follow up, but this is obviously an initial meeting setting out, agreeing the themes, and then, as I say, we've got another meeting coming.
Okay.
But just to reassure you all, what we've done is we're not waiting for a strategy to develop. We have, we've taken action both in terms of legislative programmes. In my department, as you know, we can go on to it later, a legislative programme that will impact on this agenda, but also funding across Whitehall, and then looking at areas where we can relieve some of the barriers, reduce some of the pressures and barriers immediately wherever possible, including those examples I've given you.
You said that there's another meeting in next week. Is there a timeline for the strategy's work? And you also mentioned the strategy again. Is there a timeline for when that will be published?
We expect to publish the strategy following the conclusion of the phase 2 of the spending review.
So before.
I wouldn't want to get into specifics, but just to reassure you that, and we can continue the conversation as we make progress, and as we do in Parliament. Obviously, it's not just this session. There'll be other opportunities as well for us to keep you updated.
Okay. Well, so there'll be an opportunity for us as a committee to have sight of that maybe before it's published. Is that something you're willing to share in confidence with the committee?
Well, it's an internal government report, so we are at the early stages of looking at working across government, but we are certainly keen to engage this committee, and I hope that the report of this inquiry, when that comes out, of course, we'd be keen to draw on the insights that you have. I've looked very carefully at the written evidence that was submitted for this inquiry, which is really powerful. Already you're gathering evidence that is going to be important to us.
So essentially everything's going to be detailed in the strategy when it's published before the spending review. So
there will be a strategy that will be available after the phase 2
even though we won't,
review.
Before then we won't have any terms of reference, we won't have any minutes, we won't know who's attended, but everything should be contained in the strategy. So that's what we should wait for.
I'll just bring in Penny if she wants to add anything.
That's right. As the Minister said, so the strategy will be published after the spending review, and that will then set out the government's plans going forward.
Okay. Sharba.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister. I think we've had, it's really good to hear some of the work that's going on with the task force and also with the strategy that will be developed as a result. But we have obviously previously seen a number of strategies that have come out of government. Certainly the previous government had quite big intentions around ending homelessness, which they never met. I just wanted to get an understanding of why this will be different, but also how you're taking into consideration some of the work that has already happened in this sphere. For example, the Kerslake Commission's report that came out not that long ago, which looked at how we tackle homelessness and get to the root causes, as well as lessons from things place everybody in, which happened during the COVID pandemic. How is some of that feeding into what you're developing here, so we're not just recreating the wheel?
I couldn't agree more. To reassure you, obviously we've got some great examples. You mentioned some of that. In terms of policy, the previous Labour government cut rough sleeping by 2/3. We've got a really good evidence base on what worked historically and where things can go wrong. We need to learn from success as well as failure. And there have been major failures in recent periods. Everyone again, I've asked officials to go back. In fact, Penny was very involved. She was leading on that policy. So we're lucky to have officials who've got expertise. Obviously, the Mayor of London and his team and local authorities work very closely with national government there. One of the major issues that came out of that is it's about the wraparound support, those who face complex needs in rough sleeping, who are sleeping rough, important to really invest and work on those. So while there were some things, and also accommodation availability obviously there was more supply during lockdown in terms of hotel accommodation and other forms of accommodation. So there are lessons to learn on what worked, what didn't in the past. We are also looking at previous reports and work that the committees have done, this committee and other committees, but also the work of NGOs, policy experts, those who are gathering evidence. I come from a policy background. I think it's really important that we draw on that background. I hope that you can see we're not hanging around. We are working across government. I have had bilaterals with ministerial colleagues in another number of departments already, as I say, and also I sit on a number of cross-departmental group alongside the Deputy Prime Minister, or sometimes sit on her behalf on a number of interdepartmental groups that speak to this agenda. We can't tackle homelessness and rough sleeping in isolation. So the child poverty agenda, the violence against women agenda that the Home Office is leading on, a range of those agendas are going to be really important.
No, thank you, Minister. And I think everyone will be waiting for that strategy, because just on a daily basis, London councils are spending 4 million a day. So essentially, the quicker we get that strategy, essentially a number of councils are going to face bankruptcy if this issue isn't resolved.
Just to reassure you, Chair, what we are doing in parallel, of course, is the work around supporting local authorities, both in terms of funding, but also there are the homelessness advisors in the department who work with those who are facing particular challenges. We also have a series of government programmes, pilots, the Housing First pilot and others, and I'll go on to those as we progress.
We'll come on to that. Thank you. We're going to move on now. Joe.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Minister. So to move on to standards and temporary accommodation, you referenced in your introduction that horrendous statistic of 160,000 children in temporary accommodation. It's 1 in 21 children in London. I had a constituent who'd been in temporary accommodation for 14 years come to me before Christmas. So obviously the quality of the temporary accommodation is really important. Could you tell us how the department is monitoring whether local authorities are adhering to the temporary accommodation code of guidance?
Well, first of all, what I'd like to say is that as an MP representing a constituency in London, I know how devastating it is. I have, as I know other colleagues have, dealt with life and death situations with constituents because of these sorts of issues and challenges, both in terms of shortage, but also the sort of examples you've given. Damp and mould, if it's not tackled, whether it's in social housing or private housing, can be existential for families, and indeed that's the sort of case I've had to deal with. So I'm absolutely determined that we address this. The Homelessness Code of Guidance sets out how local authorities should exercise their homelessness functions according to the 2017 Act. We also have, as you know, councils are responsible for ensuring temporary accommodation suitable and in line with the statutory framework that we set. And housing authorities, as a minimum, need to ensure that accommodation is free of Category 1 hazards, as identified by their Housing Health and Safety rating system. You will know, in terms of the legislative programme, that my ministerial colleague Matthew Pennycook is leading on. There's a raft of measures that are being introduced through the Renters Reform Bill to bring homes up to the decent standards, and that includes extending it to the private sector, following consultation. I don't know if, Penny, you wanted to add anything?
I could explain a little bit, if that's useful, about the work that my team, the Homelessness Advice and Support Team, which is a team that's of civil servants within the department but are recruited from local authority backgrounds with great experience of delivering these services, and that we work very closely with local authorities to provide a support and challenge role, to share good practice and innovation, to try and to help them to improve standards and to make better use of supply of TA as well as prevention.
And the National Audit Office said the department doesn't routinely collect data on standards. Do you think that's something that should change?
Shall I answer that one? As the Minister said, the Code of Guidance is very clear about the standards that we expect local authorities to adhere to, and we work in a...
Sorry, on that, Penny, so it's expect, not require.
There's statutory requirements as set out in the legislation and in the Code of Guidance about the suitability of temporary accommodation, and we work very closely with local authorities then to help them to achieve that.
The legislative programme is really important. And what we're doing as a government now, because there's a wider issue around improvement, around regulation, around the regulators, because the numbers are concerning. The English Housing Survey data is, obviously concerning, both in terms of the private rented sector, but also in the social rented as well. It's about 10% of dwellings, 21% in the private sector. You'll know the figures. So we need to, and Baroness Taylor, for instance, who's responsible for the housing regulator, so we need to make sure that the existing regulations are properly enforced. Where that's the case, obviously there's the opportunity for the local ombudsman to engage, and I saw the report that the ombudsman's provided in terms of submission to this committee, which we'll look closely at. But so the programme of legislation this government is introducing is going to be really important, alongside ensuring that the statutory obligations are fulfilled, and we look very closely and will continue to look closely at those. And I think if there are major gaps, and I look forward to hearing the findings of this inquiry, if there are major gaps, those are ones that the interministerial department group will need to look at.
One that we did take evidence on, and you referenced it, is evidence of category 1 hazards for children in current temporary accommodation. So just to push a bit more on this relationship with local authorities, do you think they're doing enough at the moment to monitor the quality and safety of their temporary accommodation?
Well, look, we know from our own individual experiences in constituencies, that there are huge pressures in local authorities. They've had 14 years of cuts in funding. There are pressures. This government has already increased the funding to local authorities and support. We want to work closely with local authorities to identify where the challenges are. This has got to be a partnership approach, because just saying to local authorities, you've got to do this, is not going to be enough. It's about making sure they have the right support. But where there are gaps, we will need to look at how we address that strategically, and that's why I'm very pleased that there's already legislation underway on top of what's already there to look at some of the underlying causes. And the private rented sector is key in terms of bringing, the amendments that are being made in the Renters Reform Bill to ensure that temporary accommodation in that sector is brought up to the right standard.
And in terms of that collaborative approach, I think some councils are keen to do more either buybacks or acquisitions to have their own temporary accommodation that they can keep to a higher standard. Obviously, decent home standard we hope will extend to private rented in time. Is that something the department's looking at supporting councils with in terms of increasing their own stock of temporary accommodation?
Well, look, the first thing to say is in the immediate term, as you know, immediate action that the Chancellor's taken is to provide £500 million to the Affordable Homes Programme to get 5,000 affordable homes available as quickly as possible, built or provided for those in terms of social housing. There is the 450 million that was announced just after the general election for schemes like that. That's really important. Our house building programme is absolutely critical. The 1.5 million homes that is going to be vital to addressing the supply side, because we know that if we want to bear down on the costs of the cost to society, as well as, of course, the cost to those who are suffering from living in temporary accommodation or sleeping rough, is that we've got to make sure we've got enough social and affordable housing and to ensure that happens as quickly as possible. But you will appreciate, obviously, house building it's not going to happen overnight, and that's why the Affordable Homes Programme and the other interventions like the ones you've mentioned are really important.
If I might add, the 450 million the Minister mentioned, which is for the Local Authority Housing Fund, is precisely, as you said... buybacks
can happen more quickly
than acquisition.
Exactly.
Acquisition of temporary accommodation and accommodation for resettlement programs.
And of course the capital receipts that can be used from Right to Buy, which is something that we have announced in this government, is an additional resource allocation that will be made that is now available to local authorities.
Just final question from me. Obviously, support the collaborative approach, but there may be times when some sort of sanction or oversight is needed from the department, and you do have some powers to do that around B&B, for example. Can you just give us any latest kind of analysis of the department's approach to using that? Have you had to use it since coming into government? Do you anticipate using it to ensure that councils have appropriate plans in place?
Okay, well, the first point to make is that it's really important that we get to a point that we are not having to use emergency accommodation for homeless families, and that we eliminate the use of bed and breakfast accommodation. The condition and the circumstances in which children and families find themselves, not enough cooking, the not appropriate cooking facilities. There's all sorts of issues that are well documented. You know this. I've seen that. I've visited families who are living in those circumstances. We need to tackle that. So the department's already working with 20 local authorities with the highest number of bed and breakfast homeless families to support them develop pilots. That includes Birmingham, Ealing, Leicester, through a £5 million programme on the emergency accommodation reduction.
All those 20 that you're working with, are they breaking a 6-week limit on how long they keep families in temporary in B&Bs?
These are the ones with the highest. Penny, do you want to add anything on
that? They're identified by data, which will include
yes, they are all breaking the 6-week limit.
Yeah, and we review, we publish quarterly HCLIC homelessness data. We review that quarterly, and a condition of the homelessness prevention grant funding is that any local authority that has more than 5 families in B&B over the 6-week limit has to develop a B&B elimination plan, which the department has to agree. So
they
yes,
develop
we
a
are
plan, but not facing any sanctions. But yet those families have been living in those conditions, which are, which they shouldn't be legally. So, is that correct?
Well, there are things that can be done. So there is the first step is to support local authorities to get out of that situation, because and that means the homelessness advisory teams working closely with them, developing plans, and I've seen evidence, including in my own local authority, where actually they've gone down to zero in terms of intervention. So when the department works with local authorities, and we're seeing that, then you can tackle these issues. But obviously you will appreciate, and as London MPs we feel it very strongly in terms of local authorities not having enough accommodation, and often finding as a last resort having to house people in bed and breakfast. That's why we are trying
to... There's a culture that's developed because local authorities know that the department do not collect the data, there's no monitoring, there's no sanctions. They will flout this and they'll continue to do so, and will use... Yes, we all understand and appreciate the pressures our councils are facing, but we have situations where we are now in 2025 and the data suggests that 50 young children have died as a result of the conditions linked to their temporary accommodation. Where local authorities are not facing any penalties, they will continue to place vulnerable families in these same said accommodation.
You are absolutely right, Chair. As I say, as an MP dealing with constituents who are placed in bed and breakfast accommodation, for me it is an absolute must that we need to bring down and eliminate those who are the number of people who are in bed and breakfast. And we are working with local authorities. We are seeing the impact of the work that is being done between the department, and I want to see that hands-on approach. It's also it's saving lives when preventing the risk to life. It's devastating seeing the number of children who have died. And I'm determined, working with the Deputy Prime Minister, that we do everything we can to tackle this. And what we've seen in examples like in some of the case studies is also a cost saving by dealing with these issues. That's why our focus on prevention is key, making sure local authorities have the flexibility to take action, put resources in to help families before local authorities find themselves having to get people into temporary accommodation. The point you made about getting accommodation ready for families so that they're not put in bed and breakfast accommodation. But as a last resort, local authority, the national government, the Secretary of State, of course, has the powers to intervene through the best value legislation of 1999. But that requires, obviously, not just one, it would have to be multiple themes that a local authority is breaching. But there are powers in extremities for national government to intervene.
Thank you. Will's just going to probe further on the temporary accommodation.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, so in my constituency of Woking, 40 households are in bed and breakfast accommodation at any one time. Over half of them are children, and that's on top of the over 200 households we've got in temporary accommodation. This is in Surrey, where you would think, compared to London, we'd be more on top of it, but it's an overwhelming problem. Do you believe that the regulations which place a 6-week limit on families living in B&B and temporary accommodation are fit for purpose? And I particularly ask because the average time in my constituency that's spent in B&Bs is 11 weeks, so way over the supposed deadline, but actually the range is quite shocking. So some have ranged from 1 night, and one has ranged to 44 weeks. What work is the department doing to address the rise in families living in B&Bs over that 6-week period?
Well, first of all, we inherited a really difficult set of circumstances in terms of the number of people who are homeless in our country. A number of people will come. I know we'll come on to rough sleeping, and the number of families in bed and breakfast beyond the 6-week limit between June 2023 and 24, there was a 50% increase in the number of households with children staying in BMs. It's just not acceptable. But that's what we've inherited, and we are determined to take action to address those and those issues. And that is why the Secretary of State has made clear she wants a focus on prevention, as well as, of course, providing the support to respond. And the emergency accommodation pilots are really key, and we hope to make sure, alongside the existing provisions with the advisors that are working closely with local authorities, that we support local authorities. But of course, we are determined to make sure that where things are going wrong, we work with them to tackle those issues. But you are absolutely right that this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and we are tackling it both with the funding that is being allocated, as well as the interventions that are needed, pretty hands-on intervention, alongside policy changes.
Thank you, Minister. So I agree that action is needed. I suppose the committee is concerned we've got the homelessness strategy later. We're sort of waiting for that to judge that action. You've talked about the emergency accommodation pilot. So are they able to run, be assessed, and then a decision be made on whether to roll them out nationally as part of the strategy? And then coming back to the supposed 6-week limit, is that 6-week limit something the government are considering making enforceable, rather than just at the moment, which is a guideline, and they're going to make it enforceable? We've received some evidence that some hostels are not covered by the 6-week limit. So whereas B&Bs, we believe, are, some hostels are not. Should hostels be included in that limit? And what about the wider issue of should that be enforceable?
So just to take the last one first, the statutory 6-week limit applies to privately managed B&B accommodation that includes shared accommodation, but councils have no control over who else is placed in that kind of accommodation, and we know that can put families in a vulnerable position. So that's why the first priority is to reduce the number of people and ultimately eliminate the numbers that are the use of B&B. Secondly, we don't have plans to amend the regulations to remove family hostels and assessment centres, but we are going to continue to take a close interest in this and look at this. The broader point is key, which is increasing the supply of social and affordable housing. And we've got to do that as quickly as possible in order to make sure, enable local authorities to house people in much better suitable accommodation and not have to resort to bed and breakfast accommodation. Unless we get to a point where local authorities have the available supply to house people not in bed and breakfast, then we are going to be putting plasters on a wound, and I'm not interested in that. But unfortunately, we are in a situation where we are having to stabilise the current situation while we try and get to the prevention agenda. And as we see the house building programme coming on stream and the increase in social and affordable housing, which is really crucial then we will be able to unlock some of these issues. But you will appreciate at the immediate stage, just over 6 months into a new government, those issues are not going to be, we're not going to be able to resolve them straight away. But I'm determined that we do everything we can right now, and that's the approach we've taken. Those interventions that we can make to relieve some of the pressures, and we are taking, and then also working with local authorities, mayors, as well as the charitable sector, to ensure that collectively we can reduce some of the immediate barriers that are there, that we are able to do without the bigger interventions that will take longer.
Minister, just on that, you said that on hostels you're going to monitor but not review them. What do you mean by that?
Just that's the position of the department.
Okay. And just in terms of making sure families aren't placed, going back to some of the earlier questions from Joe, do you then not feel this is why there should be an inspection on where local authorities are placing families, and we wouldn't find ourselves in this situation for the families? Because there is no clear guidance that local authorities must, and clearly a number of local authorities are not. Would you not agree that that's why we've got this vicious cycle of families being
Look,
placed?
the local authorities have safeguarding duties. They have a wide range of statutory duties, including for vulnerable children and families, and duties to ensure, and this links to out-of-area placements as well for those who are vulnerable. So there are a number of existing requirements and provisions that local authorities do need to follow, whether it be that in relation to standards, in relation to safeguarding, and so on, and making sure that where they're placing, including bed and breakfast accommodation, placing those that they have a duty and responsibility over, that they follow those obligations.
Okay. Let me come on to out-of-borough placements. Rushanara.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister. I think with out-of-borough placements, this does link on to some of the conversation that we've just been having previously around temporary accommodation and standards. First of all, given that quite a lot of out-of-borough placements are now happening in areas that are already deprived, do you think that there needs to be a reform of the legislation around this to give local authorities the ability to have those proper discussions about who's being placed in their borough? Because what we're seeing, for example, in places like Medway, that there is a huge influx of people being placed from boroughs, often in London, who are struggling, as we've already discussed, but the communication is not there between those authorities, so nobody's aware that this has happened. It places huge amounts of pressure on already stretched services, and then the conditions of those properties, as we've been discussing, can often be substandard, but who has that oversight? So do you think we need to be reviewing out-of-borough placements at this point in time?
Well, thank you very much, Nashaba. The legislation is very clear that councils should place families, those that they're responsible for, within their local area in the first instance. Obviously, you'll appreciate that going back to the housing pressures, that's not always possible. But, I recognise it's a growing problem. The Deputy Prime Minister recognises it's a growing problem. And the underlying issues, which is more longer term, is housing supply, which we are focused on. But in terms of immediate action, the Deputy Prime Minister wrote to local authorities. I responded to a debate in Parliament on these very issues because colleagues are concerned for different reasons about out-of-area placements. The Deputy Prime Minister wrote to all local authorities in England, reminding them of their duties for accommodation placements outside of their own localities, and that includes temporary housing and offers to end homelessness duty. So we want to. What we need to do is make sure that this is happening as a last resort. There needs to be better communication between the boroughs that are placing families out of borough. They have that duty, and we'll continue to monitor the situation. But as I say, and in terms of London, as a London MP, I'm conscious that obviously London boroughs have a high number who are being placed outside. A sizable number are from within, out of borough placements from one borough to another within the city. And the pressures in London in terms of accommodation availability is what's causing it, which goes back to the point about making sure that we provide resources, as we have done, in terms of the £1 billion that has been invested in the combination of funding, both in terms of prevention as well as the response on a number of agendas, is really key, so that local and regional government have the support they need to provide the accommodation. And then the final thing I'd say, once again, it's going to be absolutely crucial to get the house building agenda going, because unless we do that and get the housing on stream, both through the Affordable Homes Programme and the wider government objective to build 1.5 million homes, some of these issues aren't going to be able to be addressed. So we are determined to provide support as much as possible, increase the cooperation between local authorities, but supply is key.
Can I just come back on that, if that's okay, Chair? Thank you very much. That's really helpful, Minister. However, I think that the key point there is, first of all, around the point around communication. That is at the minute not happening, and there are plenty of examples where local authorities are not communicating with each other when this is the case, and they are placing out of borough. At the minute, the legislation says that in order to place out of borough, you need to communicate this at the point that you've placed the individuals in the host borough. At this point, it's quite late to be able to have any meaningful conversation around what the challenges might be. For example, are there enough school places for children in those areas? Secondly, there are lots of examples where management companies are buying up properties in often quite deprived boroughs and then leasing them to London at double the price they would lease to the host authority. That is artificially driving up market values in quite deprived areas, pricing out local councils that also need that accommodation for temporary use. So in some ways, we are just pushing the problem around the country. So is there anything that can be done in the immediate term around improving that communication between authorities? The guidance is there, but it isn't necessarily being met. And how do we reinforce that better? Because that's the piece that is missing, and make sure that we aren't just creating problems by taking something, for example, outside of the capital and pushing it further out to a more deprived area. Yeah.
I mean, as I say, the Deputy Prime Minister has already contacted local authorities, making clear what their responsibilities. Do you think that's enough, though, or do you think there should be more disincentives? Well, what we will do is continue to monitor the situation. I know there's strong interest in here in Parliament. We don't. Those of us who are London MPs, I don't want to speak for other colleagues, but I don't want my constituents to be placed far away. And indeed, in my own constituency, there was a big campaign locally to stop the local council from placing people out of borough, a long way from home, away from cut-off.
And just on that then, Minister, so what if none of us want our constituents placed out of borough, but why then doesn't the department require local authorities to submit that data on how far they've placed families? At the moment, there's no requirement, and they're not doing that. Do you think to help address that, the department should be asking local authorities to submit that data?
First of all, what we want to see is local authorities prioritising keeping people in their localities. That's the message that's been made very clear by the Deputy Prime Minister. I'm making that clear today. But we also recognise that in certain circumstances, because of a shortage, local authorities don't have the option of housing people locally. That's why we've got to deal with the supply side issues. But we're very clear that local authorities have the duty to ensure that they provide that information to the borough, the area that they are placing people in. And they have safeguarding duties and other duties that they must abide by. And, of course, we will continue to monitor the situation.
Did you want to come in quickly?
Just very quickly, you've outlined on a number of occasions there's a shortage of housing in London. So why is London's housing target being slashed?
Well, look, my colleague attended the committee
Minister
hearing.
Pennycook.
Minister,
you keep telling
Well,
us
no.
there's not enough housing in London.
well,
and
there's
you
not enough
target.
housing because there wasn't enough house building. That's the legacy we've inherited, and we're not going to be able to fix this overnight, but we are determined to address it. London does have huge housing pressures. There is much greater. If you look at the temporary accommodation numbers, you will see that it's significantly higher than other parts of the country. So the demand, with the greatest of respect, the demand for housing in London is much greater. The pressures are there greater. Greater Manchester also has pressures. So the fact is we have inherited a scandalous situation with homelessness and rough sleeping. And therefore we intend to build the homes that this country needs to tackle this problem. But after 14 years of underinvestment in housing, including social housing, we've got a situation that is completely unacceptable, and we're determined to tackle it. We are determined to tackle it. But let's be clear, this is not going to be solved overnight. And we are working with the mayors, including the Mayor of London, with local authorities. The Deputy Prime Minister has given evidence setting out her plans for the house building agenda across the country. We're determined to do that. But let's be clear how we ended up here. It's because of chronic underinvestment, a chronic housing shortage, a lack of focus on social and affordable housing in this country, in the previous government. And let's remind ourselves, the last Labour government cut rough sleeping and homelessness. It went in the opposite direction. We're determined to correct it, but that's the mess that has been left for us to clear up. I'm determined to do it, but I'm not going to take lectures about what's happened.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll stick to our issue of temporary accommodation and rough sleeping. And we're going to look at safeguarding, an issue that you've mentioned, Maya.
Hi, I'm going to pick up on just a few questions around immediate safeguarding risks. We've heard evidence in previous sessions where local authorities have placed families in temporary accommodation with vulnerable single adults. Are you concerned about the current safeguarding risks that these situations present?
Look, we know safeguarding is absolutely paramount, and we've seen evidence of the consequences where the quality of housing and condition of housing, if it's in poor condition, can be fatal. And that's why the changes that are being made in AWABs in terms of the Renters Reform Bill, the quality of housing, tackling damp and poor conditions, decent home standards, those changes are going to be vital to making sure that where children and families are placed are safe. And then, of course, you've got the safeguarding duties that local authorities have. But we have to make sure the quality of housing is fit for purpose and fit for habitation, and the two go hand in hand.
I think some of the concerns raised were more about in the temporary accommodation, the fact that there were instances where you had families, often young parents with children, being placed in accommodation alongside single men, single vulnerable adults, and that often would restrict things like those young parents who maybe needed the support networks to support them, but often the temporary accommodation was locking down visitors because it was a chaotic mix of a lot of different tenants. So just interested more on that side of things and whether potentially you think the code of guidance could be strengthened, for example, to ensure children's safeguarding specifically in that temporary accommodation.
You know, these are really important points, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about the work we're doing on supported housing, for instance, where we've seen well-documented cases of the women fleeing domestic violence ending up being placed in particular kinds of housing, and with children, and then along with others, and it's not suitable, and that's why on that, for instance, we've got work underway, consultation, and ensuring that we have the appropriate regulations for local authorities to make sure the quality is appropriate to address those sorts of issues. We're also putting in funding to support domestic abuse victims through the Safe Accommodation programme with an uplift of 30 million, taking it to about 160 million in the next financial year. That's just one example. Again, it goes back to the point around dealing with the underlying factors that drive people in the situation where local authorities are placing them in homes that in accommodation that they frankly shouldn't be, but end up between a rock and a hard place because of the shortage and the issues around quality and standards. So we've got to get the quality and standards right, both in terms of the general supply of accommodation as well as temporary accommodation while it's being used, as well as supported accommodation and housing. And we need to deal with the supply side, as well as, of course, we'll continue to keep an eye, work with colleagues across government on areas where there may be gaps, because we don't want to see that happen, and ensure that the relevant agencies are taking action. Not all of it is for national government. Some of it will be for regulators, some of it will be for other government departments. But that's why the Interministerial Task Force is really important, because while it's coming up focused on a long-term strategy, there are emerging immediate issues that come up that we work bilaterally with departments to address wherever possible as quickly as possible.
That's really helpful. And I guess just as a principle to reiterate then, do you feel you as a department are able to put immediate extra pressure on those local services to ensure that separation so that doesn't happen as much? Because that is what seems to be happening at the moment. There are instances where those groups are mixing and where that's not appropriate. Is there things that you could be doing immediately to kind of sort of ensure that isn't happening right now?
This is where the department's approach to having local advisors and officials working directly with mayors and council leaders is really important. Us working with mayors and council leaders, officials working with their counterparts is really important. And having the strategic discussions through the interministerial group and these expert groups is really helpful, because I'm often raising issues as we go along. I'm not just focused on developing the strategy, I'm focused on what can we do here and now, how do we use every ounce of influence we have to tackle these issues. We come from a campaigning background. If you spent 14 years in opposition, you're a campaigner on a number of issues. So that approach hasn't changed. Wherever we have issues that we need to tackle, whether it's by talking to colleagues in other government departments or in working with the relevant organisations and agencies, we do that, and that's the approach we are taking. That's the approach the department's taking, and I'm encouraging officials to do that. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, as you say, the legislation is clear that bed and breakfast accommodation, which is accommodation where there are shared facilities, where families might be sharing with other people who might not be, that's why it's not suitable. So that is absolutely clear. As we discussed earlier in this session, it should not be used for families. If it has to be used as a last resort, it should not be used beyond 6 weeks. But as we discussed, we're aware that 6-week limit is being breached more and more often by local authorities. All of the things the Minister's run through earlier are the measures that we are taking to help local authorities to get out of using that B&B accommodation. So the additional funding next year into the Homelessness Prevention Grant, the additional funding into the local government financial settlement, the local authority housing fund, so that local authorities can acquire their own stock of better TA and not have to dip into this market. The emergency accommodation reduction pilot works specifically with those local authorities that have the highest amount of breaches of that 6-week limit, and then the B&B elimination plans and the ongoing work between the department and those local authorities, all of that, the aim of which is to help find solutions, get local authorities out of having to use that unsuitable accommodation, because, as you say, and as the Minister said, we agree it's not suitable for those families.
And then just quickly, just on the sort of wider support of those children who are in temporary accommodation, we've had a number of bits of evidence that suggest a formal notification system going to schools and GPs would be really helpful to help kind of monitor those children and make sure they're supported. Do you support that? Have you considered introducing that, and where do you sit on that at the moment?
We've seen some examples. I think Oldham Council's Rochdale Council's doing that, and I know there's a campaign here in Parliament with colleagues looking at that. Anything that can be done to ensure that there's proper communication and information sharing between councils needs to happen. So I will look closely at that example.
Yeah, and within a council, again, the Code of Guidance sets out the safeguarding duties. So housing authorities have a duty to safeguard children under the Children Act. There's a duty to cooperate with children's services within the local authority and to share appropriate information. There's interagency statutory guidance about those parts of the authority working together, and again that's all set out in the Code of Guidance, and we expect local authorities to be meeting what's in that Code of Guidance. It's statutory guidance.
Thank you. Just on that Code of Guidance, Penny, a lot of our written submissions have argued for that Code of Guidance to be strengthened, so it clearly sets out the safeguarding duties for local authorities when placing families in temporary accommodation. Is that something that you'd support and agree with?
I think, as we said, we think the Code of Guidance is really clear, but I'm sure that the Minister will be interested to hear what the committee has heard.
Absolutely. We shouldn't be, local authorities shouldn't be hanging around for changes. There is existing provision, they need to follow it, and if there are gaps, I'm sure this committee will be making sure that the interministerial group it takes those points on board, and I'm very happy to feed that in to the Deputy Prime Minister and others, as we'll do with other suggestions that this committee comes up with.
Thank you. Just moving on to our next